I'm Yvette, and I don't believe that minors should be socially or medically transitioned.
And I'm Laura Travanik, and I think there is a way to responsibly oversee a medical transition in children and in adolescents.
I don't agree with Laura.
And I don't agree with Yvette.
But we both agree that although we come to different conclusions about this, it's important to understand why.
We have agreed to disagree about gender. I am probably not going to change Yvette's mind on this.
And I don't think I will convince Laura.
But I'm hoping I can make you think.
And I'm hoping I can make you think.
So hello again, and welcome to our second episode of Agree to Disagree with About Gender. I'm Laura Travanik. I'm one of the hosts, and I'm here with Yvette Neri, one of my co-hosts. So how are you doing, Yvette?
I'm doing fine.
Yeah. So anything like, as you know, with this podcast, for those of you who are seeing this for the first time, this is our second episode, but for those of you who are seeing us for the first time, the idea behind this was that me as a trans woman and Yvette as a gender critical woman thought it would be good to model sort of civil and thoughtful conversations about some of the more contentious issues around trans people and their place in society. And we already filmed one episode. Many of you might have caught it. I saw it had about 800 views as of the time of our taping, where we discussed single-sex spaces and about whether trans women like myself or people who are trans, whether they should or shouldn't have access to single-sex spaces. Of course, there was a lot that we disagreed on, but some things that we agreed on. I think it was a good conversation that had a fairly good engagement. I think over 10,000 people saw some of our clips on Twitter, and like I said, about 800 people viewed it, and there was very active in the comments. And so clearly this seems like there's an audience developing for these types of conversations. And so I'm glad we're able to connect with an audience, and hopefully you'll enjoy this episode, which is going to be focused on pediatric medical transition. Now, we've both had a long journey to come to a current understanding of this issue around pediatric medical transition, and even about the words we use to talk about pediatric medical transition. As we said in our intro, the goals here are not to change each other's mind, but to really understand how we got to where we are and how our views have potentially evolved over time and where they may still evolve over time. And so I think it's important to understand what inform our perspectives and why we feel so passionately about what we believe is right. But the other reason we're having these conversations is we really think it's important to have an even-handed and good faith platforming of two sides of a very contentious issue. And as in our original episodes, we're not looking to call each other out. We're not trying to make the other look silly. We're not trying to score points on each other. But at the end of this conversation, I don't want someone to look at this and say that I won or Yvette won, but just that we made you think about it. We're not trying to tie each other up in knots. We really want you to come to your own understanding of this issue and see if anything we've said helps you evolve or you develop your views on this. Now, I know many of our listeners are going to come to this with very strong points of view, and we hope some of them will coming to us generally questioning about how they should be thinking about these issues, or perhaps open to a different perspective. And so maybe just because I understand some people here may not know me from before, this may be, even though this is our second episode, this may be some people's first episodes, maybe let's just give people a little bit of background about who we are and why we're doing this. So Yvette, tell me a little bit about who you are and why you're excited about this.
Well, I'm a mother, a grandmother. I'm a longtime out lesbian. I worked the Michigan Women's Music Festival for 10 years. And in that process, being at the festival, I was seeing in real time the development of this contention about trans women and women's single-sex spaces, like the Michigan Women's Music Festival. The intention of it was for women who were born female. And so that was impacting me from 2003 on. And then later, as I had seen on social media a meme about chicks with dicks, and I was offended by that. And so I started going and doing a deep dive in about 2017. And so I was learning what was going on in the world, not only with transgenderism, but the transition of children. And so through that, I was already learning the problems with medical transition for kids. I was learning how much things had changed since even 10 years earlier. And I also at that point started to get to know many of the detransitioners who I've then gotten to know in person.
Yeah, so it's understandable as someone who is obviously was had some skepticism about sort of, let's say, the transgender project, and then as news started coming out, and I think the timing's probably about right in mid 2017, where we started to see more articles at least reaching the lay press, where it was getting wider coverage about some of the concerns that were being raised about gender clinics. For it sounds like a very natural progression. So so for me, just to give you a little bit of my background for people who don't know me from before, is I'm a middle-aged adult trans woman. I am I've transitioned, I started my transition 25 years ago, and basically for most of my adult life, I lived as an integrated trans woman where I made very little reference to my history of transition. And thankfully, because of my body type and my presentation, was able to pass without people at least publicly confronting me on my trans status. What people actually figured out on their own, I don't know, but basically, I didn't have to deal on a day-to-day basis with the fact that I had a trans history. I'm someone who is in a long-term relationship with a heterosexual man. I have a child from a previous relationship and two children with him who are adolescents. Currently, thankfully, for our family, who have shown no sign of being gender variant or gender incongruent, and hopefully will stay that way. But what really informs me about this is that even though I didn't transition as a child, I transitioned in my mid 20s. Is that like many of the children who do transition, I lived for a long time with gender incongruence, and my gender incongruence, or my sense of gender incongruence, started when I was very young, before puberty. And even though I didn't necessarily express that in ways that were hyper effeminate, my parents recognized that I was someone who was not terribly masculine, and were very quick to inform me, and not out of any disgust, but just because they didn't, we were from a time where boys were boys and girls were girls, and they were very concerned that I was not sort of integrating well with the other boys. I didn't play like the other boys. I found boys very overwhelming. And I learned very quickly that the desire, the curiosity that I had about being a girl or being female was not something that I should pursue aggressively, if I wanted to stay, good with my family and also good with myself. Because the other thing that was going on is one thing that many people maybe don't know about my background is I'm Jewish, and I had religious education from a very young age, even though my family was not terribly religious. They thought it was very important for us as children to have this exposure, and so I went to a private Jewish religious school. And so a lot of and as you know, there's fairly strict rules in the Bible about what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl. And I grew up, as many children who are exposed to religion young, fairly God-fearing. And I began to view my desire to be a girl, or my curiosity to be a girl, about temptation. So God is testing you, and this is the trial that He is putting before you, that you have to resist to show your faith in God and your commitment to being a fully functional person. And very similar to how God sent an angel to struggle with Jacob, or sent a number of tribulations down on Job that he had to fight through to show his faith in God, or Daniel wrestling the lion. This was my struggle, is that God, for whatever reason, decided in His wisdom that He was going to give me this temptation, and my goal to be a good Jew was to show resistance to this and to struggle against this. And then we also learned, and this is, growing up as a Jew in the 80s, and this prayer maybe isn't as popular in more mainstream Jewish circles, although it's still done in religious circles, is that there's a set of 13 prayers that every Jew is supposed to pray every morning. And these include things like, you thank God for not making you a Gentile, or you thank God for not making you a slave. The prayer that follows this is, if you were a boy, is that you would thank God for not making you a woman. That was sort of a key thing. Whereas the girls would do a different prayer, which was, I thank God for making me according to His will. This was obviously in Hebrew, but it was obviously, as a boy, you learned very quickly that you were lucky, or you were fortunate, or it was God's will that you were born a boy, and that to be a girl was something lesser than. And so this was something that I struggled with. And as much as I had this part of my brain that had this curiosity and this desire to want to experience life as a girl and have a lot of curiosity what that was like, I also knew that it was wrong. And as I got into adolescence, and whereas I know there's a popular perception that for many that puberty maybe solves this problem, for me it really intensified it, because then you throw on sort of all the testosterone fueled urges, and obviously the changes in bodily development, and my brain saying, this is going to make being a girl a lot harder if I ever choose to pursue this, but I also know that I'm not supposed to pursue this because it would be an affront to God and it'd be an affront to my family. And so this was a struggle that I grew up with. And even though I didn't transition during that time, I had to live with that struggle. And I remembered how painful this was, not only in my adolescence, but as it worsened into early adulthood. And when I eventually decided to transition in my mid-20s, I was left with 15 years of testosterone exposure and having to struggle through life as a guy where it wasn't really the best life, or I didn't feel it was the best life for me, and having to manage the consequences of that as an adult. Now, I don't know how my life would have turned out if I had been in a different family or in a different era or in a different religious background where that transition would have been made, the possibility to transition would have been made available to me. I don't want to presume that my life would have been 100 times better because my life turned out pretty well. But I do think about it a lot. And I have a lot of, and I think about that for kids nowadays who are clearly struggling with the same kind of dysphoria that I did, is do I want to wish this on them? The suffering that I had when there seemed to be options available. And I, just like people who are detransitioned, I know a lot of people because of the circles I move in who had the opportunity to transition young and are doing well, who are now fully formed adults who are thriving and living full-on lives with the restrictions that that having a gender transition constrains around the ability to have children, as an example, or the ability to find a partner, or the struggle with finding a partner, I should say, but who swear up and down that they're living great lives. And objectively, there are a lot of things that are going well. These are people who have good jobs, who own property, who have friends, who've managed to start families like I have, who have been able to pursue happiness that they feel they would not have had the same access to if they had delayed their transitions. So what are your when I tell these stories, I used to find that these stories were very resonant. Like when I used to talk about my dysphoria and how I suffered with it and how I don't want kids to suffer through it, it was very resonant. And I know in the current era, these stories have a lot less resonance because I think there's more awareness of my exposures tended to be only the good outcomes. And we have learned now that this doesn't always go the way that it did for me. And this doesn't always go that way for the people that I know who are transitioning young or who did transition young and are now adults. So what are your concerns? When I tell these stories, why wouldn't you have wanted me to have that life? Or why wouldn't you have wanted the people who have done well to have that life?
So I do want people to live good lives, and nobody wants children and minors to live in pain. But we're assuming that transition as a minor with blocking puberty and cross-sex hormones is the only option. What I would hope for youth is to recognize earlier when they are having these struggles, these thoughts, to do everything in our power to stop the bullying. When I hear people talk about people who have transitioned, what they dealt with as children, number one comes what people talk about is the bullying, the relentless, cruel bullying, and no adults are stepping in. No one's stopping it.
Like for children who are gender nonconforming or odd in some way.
Kids who are very gender nonconforming, and especially boys.
Yeah. So I think that is an issue that probably there are probably some kids, and this obviously enters into a fairly complicated scheme because I think one of the things that the medical system has struggled with, and you touched on this a little bit, is thinking there was only one way to be trans, in a sense that if you were trans, you were trans, and no one really gave too much thought about why people developed trans identities. It was just assumed that if you had it, you were born with it, that this would have happened no matter what culture you lived in, no matter what family you lived in, no matter what your other circumstances were, and that it's not going to go away unless you transition, and so you might as well transition younger as opposed to older because why prolong the inevitable? And I think there was a time when this may have been, I'm not saying it was absolutely true, but when it was more or less true. And I think this raises some issues in terms of why my views have evolved on this. So if I go back to my childhood, which is I grew up I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s. I don't know what made me gender curious at first. I have no idea when that started. Like I can think back to sort of when I was 5 or 6 thinking about it, but obviously there was something in my brain that made it more likely for me to be triggered by whatever my triggers were. Like that I'm sure an average boy would not have been triggered by. Like we were probably watching the same shows and reading the same books and having, my parents are lovely people, and I suffered no physical or abuse or neglect. Or we were a middle class family that maybe didn't have everything, but we had everything we needed. We had food on the table, and we got kisses and hugs at night, and we were part of a large community. It was a great childhood. But for whatever reason, something triggered me and made me very curious about gender as a young person. I'm the kind of person who, if gender transition was a thing when I was younger, like if that was something that was accessible and if it was something my parents were to get behind, that I probably would have done fine. I can't say what I've done as good as I've done like in my life now, but I probably would have been one of the good outcomes in some way. The challenges is that the cohort of today is very clearly different than kids like me. If it was all kids like me, primarily natal males, maybe with a few natal females, who had gender curiosity or gender or clear gender identity from a young age, or was not obviously secondary to some trauma, that if it was just if our cohort had remained the same, like a small number of children, that the outcomes would probably be fine, and it would not have raised any red flags, or it wouldn't have raised many red flags. But there was something that clearly happened in the 2000s and 2010s, and we can all speculate about what this was, but something happened that caused first of all, that there caused more young people to identify as being trans, and whether that was a core identity or whether they thought it was a solution to a problem. You may be familiar with Sasha Ayad. I read her blog recently, and she describes this as people using trans as a strategy to, like, how do I deal with this problem? And I think that started to happen to some extent, where it wasn't just people who had it from a young age, but people who were trying to think, maybe I'm trans, and maybe that's why I feel the way I do about all these things that are not going well in my life. And as a result, more people were coming to medical attention. And so you ended up with this cohort that was very different and very, I refer to it sometimes as a contaminated cohort. It includes people like me, who are likely going to have good outcomes, but also includes a mixed bag of people whose outcomes are going to be much less clear if they're exposed to gender affirming care. And we see this because there were more girls. There were more girls, particularly, who had psychological issues, more girls who had histories of abuse or neglect, more histories of childhood sexual trauma, histories of you mentioned autism, people who just, I think especially with young girls, like girls who just struggle to be girls and struggle to follow the rules of girlhood, who started to believe that maybe the reason I'm having these struggles is because I'm trans, where the trans is now is potentially a secondary issue. And I think the medical system was very slow to recognize. Not that this was for sure the case, but that this was a possibility.
Well, the change in the DSM
yeah.
also helped shoe that in, and WPATH Standards of Care 8, removing age minimums, also enters into this.
Yeah.
This information these kids were getting was all over social media.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's all over YouTube now. It's all over TikTok. Yeah. And they get to be special people, not awkward autistic people, or the child who has a disabled sibling. I've seen that too. A child having a disabled sibling, and then the way to be special. And I'm not saying the child thinks, oh, how can I be special? But then it comes up. Right. And it's not a conscious, oh, I'm going to pick this thing, but it does serve a purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
and then also another big difference with the explosion of the internet, the explosion of children having, and when I say children, I really mean minors. I mean, to me, 40-year-olds are kids now too. I'm just gotten that old.
Yeah. Kid at heart too still.
Right. Thank you. But they also have, unprecedented access to porn. And many detransitioners talk about, if you listen to their stories and talk to them enough, they talk about how porn exposure and porn addiction for many, this contributed to their belief that they were trans.
Yeah. So
and so that, I'm not going to go into great detail, but there are these other factors too.
Yeah. So I think there's a bit of a there, but I think it cuts in two ways. So, like, I think obviously being a child, like I mentioned earlier, I have adolescents, and the way they are experiencing adolescence as presumed cisnormative boys who, as far as I know, have no trans impulse whatsoever. The way they're experiencing the world is very different than the way that I experience the world. And absolutely, the amount of knowledge that they have at their fingertips to find things out that they're curious about is much greater. And whether it's sort of benign things like figuring out how many people, how many people live in this city, the ability to look that up in an instant as opposed to having to go to the library to look that up, or finding out information or finding about, you mentioned pornography or contentious topics that we would have protected our children from, or that children would not have necessarily been as exposed to as young people. It's a very different world. And I don't want to say everything is social media or everything is pornography, but it is a different world. And even though I recognize the evidence base saying that social media causes transgenderism or causes people to explore their gender is weak.
I cannot agree with that. It doesn't cause it.
Yeah,
but with the autistic kids with the superpower of obsession,
yeah,
there are many, many rabbit holes
that you can go down.
That you can go down and that can easily take them into harm's way.
Yeah. So I totally agree with that. If you're a kid who's strange, or if you're a kid who's not fitting in, and you want to fit in, and you're trying to figure out yourself, why is it that I'm having trouble forming relationships? Why am I having trouble forming friendships? Why is everyone making fun of me? Why don't I seem to be able to engage in conversations like other kids are having? And you're trying to find that root cause. And to say, well, it's because you're autistic, it's like, well, that doesn't really help, because what am I going to do with that? Or it's because you are, whatever, you just have a different emotional resonance that kids don't relate to. It's hard for kids, whereas if you say, well, maybe it's because I am this, and if I solve this problem, that it will make my life better. I can understand the allure of going down that rabbit hole, and now I have a potential solution to a problem.
And they're love bombed when they go online and they're in bulletin boards and chat rooms, and they say, I think I'm trans. Yeah. Oh, you're so brave. And they do get love bombed.
Yeah. Now, here's the other side to this, though, which is that if you are, for lack of a better term, true trans, where it's something you had for a while. So I grew up in an age where I had these feelings, and I didn't know why I had them. And I thought they were evil. And I thought it was an affliction. And I thought it was wrong. But I could not find any information to tell me who I was or why I was feeling the way I did. I remember when I was 14, I went to our downtown library where they had a single copy of a book about transsexualism. And I took that book and I folded it into another book and sort of hid in a carrel at the back of the library so I could kind of read and understand a little bit about who I was. And some of it resonated and some of it didn't. But I didn't actually know anybody who was. And this really delayed my understanding of self and caused me a lot of suffering that I didn't have to have. Now, what eventually prompted my transition, and where I moved from this, like, I don't get this is just something I have to live with, it's painful, but everybody's got painful things that they're living with, to something that made it a possibility, was the internet. It wasn't social media per se, but it was me getting an online account, getting an AOL account, and being able to explore bulletin boards and being able to reach out to people of very different gender expressions. Some people who were gay, some people who were cross-dressers, some people who were transitioning, and understanding, okay, like, who am I like who's my tribe? Where do I fit in best? And so my transition was enabled, in a sense, because of the internet coming. And I often say that my transition probably would have started in the late 90s or 2000s, early 2000s, regardless of how old I was. So if I was born in, let's say, the mid-80s instead of the mid-70s, I probably would have discovered this and would have saved me a lot of hassle. Whereas if I was born in the 50s, it probably would have been delayed until I was 40 and learned enough about myself. So it works both ways, and both it can maybe trigger an inappropriate journey in people in whom this maybe isn't the right choice, but it also really opens up the world to self-understanding for people like myself. And the challenge is, how do we differentiate those who are coming in with some intrinsic cross-sex desire or some intrinsic cross-sex identification from those who are just like, I'm weird, and maybe if I was a girl, or if I was born natally female, maybe if I was a boy, it would solve some problem. And whether it's the problem of now people will like me and I'll have a community and there'll be people who get me, or is it a problem where it's like, or is it a discovery of maybe this is something true about myself that I need to explore because that will help me find a path that works for me?
Well, that's a good point about being able to find community and genuine information. That was a part of my coming out process also. in the late 90s, I was an early adopter of the internet and found Xena warrior princess fandom, which is full of lesbians and 30-year-old men living in their mother's basement.
Yeah, so like we all have our way into it, but like I came in, but the reason, I just want to come back to pornography because I think like my kids, um, being they connect to the internet, they have access to this, and I honestly don't know the extent of what they're looking at. We've had talks about pornography and about that it's not representative of the real world and things of that nature, and that it's alluring but it can be damaging, and but I still think that it's hard for a kid, like if a kid sees transsexual pornographic images, I think most kids are going to be like somewhere between that's gross, that is weird, that's not something I'm keen to explore. And so kids, I think, seek out the pornography that is interesting to them. So I don't think that exposure to transsexual porn, as an example, can make someone trans unless they have some predilection to being aroused by those kind of images in the first place. Like when I think like people see, like I don't know, like I was not a consumer, but people I would think who are interested in this seek out the porn they're interested in, as opposed to being exposed to porn that makes them interested in it. But I'm not a scholar on this, and it wasn't part of my story.
Well, I would say, well, actually, I do want to read Joe Bartosh's book about porn that was very recently published. But even outside, I haven't read that yet.
Yeah.
Um, like I don't think kids who for whom porn is an aspect of their transition are looking up trans porn. I think that's a different genre. But for a lot of males, there's the shame and the what do they call it? Where humiliation.
Yeah.
And especially where women are being humiliated. For some girls who want to become boys, if they say if that's what a woman is,
I don't
I
want
can't.
Yeah.
I want nothing to do with that. It's because it's the man in there who keeps his dignity, who is not being, and for the most part, unless you get into other humiliation things. But for a lot of young men who have later detransitioned, it was humiliation porn. And even Andrea Chu wrote that sissy porn made Chu trans.
Yeah, no, like I think obviously I think for any individual there can be these sort of strange individual pathways. I just find I'm just highly skeptical that like if my children were exposed to that kind of porn that they would find it alluring in any way.
So typically when people start watching porn, they have to escalate and escalate the extremity and the deviance of what they're looking at for it to still do the job. No, and this is why while kids are wiring their brains, it is common for kids as young as 8 or 9 to be accessing pornography.
Don't get me wrong. Like I think pornography is bad. And it's especially bad for young people. I'm okay with adults, with adults incorporating into their life in various ways. Recognize, and I don't want to get into a whole side conversation about, sex work and pornography and whether it's ethical and that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't think porn is good for kids. I don't think instant access and the range of pornography that people can get is great for the developing mind. And if there was a way to regulate it effectively, I would be 100% for it. And I don't need to see long-term data on that. It's intrinsically, you can tell it's not a good idea. And I don't want to hyper focus on this, but I guess I guess the point is whether you can induce, and I believe this in some ways, that there are some kids, whereas the party line used to be for a while that transness is innate, it's immutable. Once it's there, it can never go away. And so you might as well get on with treating it. And then that eventually, as you sort of alluded to, that sort of transitioned into, well, this is just a normal variant of human nature. That to be trans is not intrinsically unhealthy, and that it's really the stigma and the discrimination that goes along with people who are gender variant or gender incongruent or being trans that causes the bad health outcomes. To one where we kind of are increasingly recognizing, even though I know it's still hard to say this in some pro-trans circles, but I've been on the record saying I do think some dysphoria is induced. it's induced and it's not the same as intrinsic dysphoria like I had. It's something that is being induced by something, whether it's social media, whether it's pornography, whether it's something in the world at large. But these are kids who would not have been dysphoric in an earlier generation or in a different culture, and who now we have to manage their dysphoria. And when we started applying treatment protocols that were primarily developed on people who were intrinsically trans and started imposing them on a group of children that was a mixed bag of some who were intrinsically trans, but then a whole bunch where it may have been induced or aggravated by the environment, that it would be reasonable to presume that the outcomes may not be as great as they would have been had you been dealing with a population that was purely intrinsically trans.
And that's, I mean, that's an interesting concept. And I respect your distinction of kids, and these are going to be primarily boys who have had those thoughts as far back as they can remember.
Yeah.
Like, I don't, is trans intrinsic? Like, I don't know.
Like, I'm not saying it started right in the womb, but like like I said earlier, there was something that happened, whether it's genetic or whether it's something that happened in the womb or whether it's something that happened in early life that made that trigger stick. Like,
right. Or that boy who's sensitive, who cries a lot, who is overwhelmed by other boys, who doesn't want to play rough like that.
Yeah.
They know that that's being a failed boy.
Yeah, and I can't say that
and
for me. Like,
who are, well, I mean, I don't know. I can't say for you or for any particular individual exactly what was that trajectory. I'm speaking in generalizations.
And I don't think it's actually critical whether it's born that way or whether it develops.
Oh, I think it's not born that way. I don't think adult sexual orientation or adult identification is inborn. I think there are predispositions.
Yes,
and
exactly.
And how kids identify themselves or make sense of the world, how they coalesce that can totally include like these assumptions of, I get beat up and I don't want to play baseball, and that's what boys do, so I must be a girl. I like the girls better, so I must be a girl. And that coalesces.
Yeah, and I don't know like what it was in my case or what it is. Like, every kid probably has a slightly different path, but
right.
My general thinking is there's some exposure in a susceptible child that triggers cross-sex desire or a sense of cross-sex identity that eventually consolidates over time and becomes very difficult to reverse.
Right.
Especially when it happens young.
Yes, and that's why I wish in my world that little boys would be able to talk about that, or if people were sensitive to that these little boys should know that there's no wrong way to be a boy, and it's fine to like to play with the girls. That boys can prefer to play with the girls too.
Yeah, and I have no idea whether like a different parenting strategy at a young age would have caused me to develop a different sense of self. Like, these are all very speculative things, but I think what we're sort of getting towards is there's a couple things which I think are important, which is that trans experiences can be, I think, which we've sort of covered, can be very different from one like myself or one like the other people who sort of knew, whatever you mean by know, or at a young age where it gets sort of really cemented into your brain and becomes sort of like any tree that takes root. You can't just sort of pull it out. Therapy is not going to pull out every last root and branch. To those who are using transness or coming to understand their sense of self or their sense of gender, potentially as a strategy or where dysphoria is induced, and these might be two very different cohorts that can look similar in some ways. I wanted to really talk about sort of two things that are important to me, and I want to talk to them because I've changed my mind on these things over time. One is about really young people. So the kind of people who are, and I see this increasingly online, and you've seen this too, where someone posts a photo of their 6 or 7-year-old and saying, we want to introduce you to this person with a new name. Let's just say a girl's name. You might have known this person as their boy's name, but we've recognized that they have a feminine soul and they were miserable as being a boy, and we've let them explore this, and we've now decided we are going to raise our son as our daughter, and we'd love you all to welcome. We'd love to welcome Elisa, making up a name, into your lives, and And most people tend to be very kind of like, oh, good for you. Like, that's great. I'm, especially in liberal circles like the ones I live in. And I was someone who would have been also unequivocally in every circumstance be, that's fantastic. I'm glad you're getting on this early because of the pain I went through. Let this child have a full life where they don't have the burden of having to struggle through their masculinity all through their childhood and adolescence. Let them grow up to be a girl like at least externally, like every other girl, form girl friendships, socialize as a girl, start their adult life as a fully functional girl with, the recognizable limitations. I have also come to understand, and this through conversations with people like yourself, but also just through my own reading, that um, many of these people are that I'm now skeptical about those stories about, is this story as bad? Are parents using this as a strategy to cope with femininity, or to, and I'm not saying nefariously, just out of like, yeah, my child is struggling with masculinity. This seems like a solution. My child seems happier with femininity. Why should I be the one to stand in the way of this? Um, but I am more wondering now about things like path dependence, that once you start this path, even if it doesn't involve medicalization, even if it obviously doesn't involve surgery at a young age, that once that child is on that path, that they are committed. And even though technically, yes, you can go back and say once you hit puberty, yeah, you can go through male puberty, very few will. And what we don't know is how many would have if you had been, I'm not saying necessarily nasty about it, but if you would have taken an approach more like the one you're taking, where where you're punishing gender variance, but where you are embracing gender variance, but without embracing a change in gender role. Does that work? Now, I don't have any evidence on this, but there is some suggestive evidence to suggest that some of those kids will not transition or will have less of an urge to transition. And I don't know, and I don't want to pretend to know that those kids won't transition when they're 20, or that that they have a mentally healthy adolescence. But I think, and I've written about this in my Substack, that even for someone who transitions early, the best possible outcome, that they grow up to have a partner, a close friend circles, a good job, a happy life, lots of hobbies that they pursue, that it's still going to be a little bit less than the life that if they had grown up to be cisgendered and functional. But that also presumes that there is a path that they could have had all those other things, the family, the close relationships, the ability to pursue happiness, mental health and well-being, while being cis. And I don't know that. And so I've sort of settled on this midpoint that that outcome may not be possible for every gender incongruent girl or every gender incongruent child. And maybe the best outcome for that child is to be me. Maybe the universe where they end up being a fully functional, happy, mentally healthy cisgender male was not in the cards for them. I don't know that.
You've brought up several things that I wanted to talk about. And one is the topic of socially transitioning small children. And I personally find that this is very problematic. A child, a 3-year-old boy who loves Frozen and wants to wear a princess dress, is a little boy who loves the movie Frozen, and he wants to wear a princess dress. I'm fine with, sure, let's wear the princess dress at home. And if we want to make like a little wig for you so you can be Elsa, okay, let's do that. But don't I know some kids like this are then told that that makes them a girl before they even understand what being a girl or a boy is.
Sure.
And yeah, and even the 6-year-old, the 7-year-old, the 8-year-old, even coming up a little 8, 9, they often don't really fully understand what it is to be a girl or a boy.
And that's really important, what it means to be, but it's also like, an 8-year-old who's thinking, let's say, has like, if you would have asked me and said you could be a girl tomorrow, I probably would have jumped on it. But I wouldn't have had the knowledge that, like, well, does that mean I'm capable of being a mother? Does that mean I'm capable of am I just going to be like every other girl? Like, if it's magic, sure. If it's hormones and surgery, no, but I wouldn't have had the capacity at 8 to understand that.
Right. Those kids can't understand that.
Yeah.
And children trust the adults around them to tell them the truth.
Yeah.
And so when your mother at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old is telling you, yes, you're a girl, that does cement that path.
Yeah.
Because the child believes the parent.
So here's the alternative, and this is why I still need and keep the option open, which is that let's say we adopt your parenting strategy, which I think is a good strategy, of saying, okay, I have a child who likes feminine things, is into whatever, into hair and nails, and likes dressing as Elsa, and likes more girl type play, or likes or feels more comfortable forming relationships with other girls, and say, okay, but you're still a boy. You can be a feminine boy. We're not going to judge you on having effeminacy or femininity, but we're not going to say your name is now girl's name and that you are a girl. Um, and let's say this works for a while. And if it does, I'm like all for it. You should continue. And then when puberty happens, whatever happens, happens. If they go through male puberty and they're comfortable with it and don't get dysphoric, excellent. But let's say this child is now doing this, but and you are being a good parent. You are being you are being a vet, and your child is struggling, and it's not enough that they can dress at home as Elsa or even show up at school as Elsa. That the intensity of that cross-sex desire or is worsening, and it's now starting to impact on your child's mental health, like the lights going out. And now you're kind of faced with like, how hard do I push on this? Like, how stubborn do I want to be on sticking with my child's natal sex and the development, and how tempting it might be, or how effective it might be to be like, okay, like I've done everything I can. I've tried to be open about this. I haven't sort of been like the religious, I hear, very conservative parent of like trying to beat it out of your kid, which I don't think works either. At some point, it might be okay. Well, we tried that. Now what? And so I still think there are some kids, and I recognize the kind of things we've talked about that for some kids this gives a sense of, or parents especially, gives a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. Now we have this trans child, we have all these trans child things to do, we have these trans child social groups, we've got medical appointments, we've got a journey that we're on. It becomes very motivating, and having a sense of purpose is a very strong, it gives you a very strong sense of accomplishment. I get all those things, but there's also those parents who aren't necessarily, they don't want their kids to be gender variant. They don't want their kids to enter trans, but they also see a kid where the light's going out, or where they're really struggling, or where they're starting to develop the sense of self-hatred. And then what do you do?
So then what do you do? One thing, transitioning as an adult is not a bad outcome. That's not the problem.
It's not necessarily a bad outcome. We'll come back to it, but I'm going to say it's not
right. It's not de facto a bad outcome, because you've had a fantastic life. I know other trans people who have had fantastic lives, and I would want to tell that child, this is an adult decision that an adult cannot make for you.
Yeah.
And because what we haven't been saying when we're talking about this is, number one, I don't think today, at least, we can identify the child who will transition as an adult. And that may be arguable, but the kinds of things that I've read and I've learned says that we can't predict that.
Yeah.
And then what transition looks like today is stopping puberty. And people talk about it in terms of like, oh, we'll block the puberty you don't want, and then we'll induce the puberty you do want. But that is not scientifically accurate, because puberty is it's a cascade of developments that matures a child into an adult. And it includes secondary sex characteristics, but it includes, bone density and the growth plates capping off properly, like in the bones. It includes mental and emotional maturity. And when you block it, especially completely, and then go to cross-sex hormones, yes, a child on estrogen will grow breast tissue. Yes, a child on testosterone will grow facial hair. And, those things will happen, but that's not puberty.
Yeah.
It may be an appearance of puberty, but it's not puberty. And so, how do we decide that puberty isn't important, and that there aren't ways to support that child who is really struggling with being in a male body or their female body? How do we increase the scope of their world so that does not become the one thing that they are.
Yeah. So I want to come back to the puberty question because it's obviously critical. It's like, it's the thing that all this kind of hinges on is it always morally wrong, or not, I shouldn't say morally wrong. Is it always medically wrong to let puberty, medically and ethically wrong to stop puberty, or are there potentially exceptions to that rule? But the when I go back to social transition, I think where I've arrived right now, and this is subject to change, is that people looked at social transition as kind of this neutral thing. And it's not neutral. It's highly consequential. And that if you are going to socially transition your child, it should be a medical decision. Even though it may involve medicine, it should be a medically supervised decision, meaning that that child has had a significant and standardized psychological assessment, that there has been some home visits and observations of the parents, that there's been psychological assessment of the parents, and that if a parent chooses to transition their child without having that medical clearance, it should be considered malpractice, or bad parenting at the very least, because I share these concerns about it's hard for me to tell, because when I'm a physician, I see people. They tell me their story. I don't know what's really going on. Like, I met them for 15 minutes or half an hour every 3 months, and they go home, and then I don't really know what's going on in that home. And if I'm making, and the kind of medical decisions I'm making are not necessarily consequential on what's going on in the home, but this is something where you really need to understand what's going on. And you might, where it involves a social worker, where it involves a psychological assessment, not just of the child, but of the other important people in that child's life, so that you can come to maybe a committee that makes a decision to say, yes, given all this, a social transition makes sense, and we will countenance it. Or we think socially transitioning this child will be highly consequential, and it should not be encouraged, and that we would consider it, I'm not necessarily saying child abuse, but some form of neglect to do that. And I think this needs to be looked at with more seriousness. And I think the medical community has been, if you look at the WPATH guidelines, they'll say, yes, you should talk about it's kind of loose and nebulous. Yes, you should talk about families who are transitioning their child or thinking about transitioning their child, but there's not really any process. It's just kind of, in the end, if you decide to do it, you do it, and we're going to support it.
And that's because we're in this era that it has been de-psychopathologized.
Yeah.
That it is normal, and that to say anything other than, yes, dear, you are, whatever you say you are, is called conversion therapy, and professionals can lose their job. Yeah. They can lose their license for doing the exact thing that you're talking about.
Yeah, and although I'm skeptical of like the depathologization language, because I think pathology can take on different meanings, where someone says something is a pathology, it implies like some sort of moral decay. Like, there's just different layering that people put on it. But I agree. That, like, and I talked about this in terms of my own life, is that even though I've had, like I said, this incredibly successful trans life, that it's come at a significant cost that I wouldn't have had to pay if there was a pathway for me to grow up as equivalently mentally and physically healthy as a cis male, because I've had to pay with the irritations of transition. I'm on long-term medication. I've had multiple surgeries. Those cost money. Those took time. There was pain. It worked out, but those were costs that I would not have had to pay if there was an alternate path. And I'm not saying that alternate path existed. It may not have. But if there were, I wouldn't have had to pay. And so to be kind of all airy-fairy about, oh, it's just another way to be, that it's all stigma. It's like, yeah, there's stigma, and that's important. But even I've had the fortune of living a life that's relatively free of stigma. And whatever stigma I take on, I kind of just bring on myself because I've become public with it. But I didn't have, like, I moved through the world, and it's not like people are pointing and laughing at me everywhere I go. People treat me as a female because I give that impression. But even though I've had minimal stigma, there's still been a cost that I've had to bear. And that's important to recognize. And when we transition children, we are assigning to them that cost. Now, that cost, the benefits of that might outweigh the cost. That's fine. In my case, it did. But it's hard, but you at least have to acknowledge that you are imposing a cost. Now, I want to come back to puberty, because this is, I know, in an area that we've discussed a lot, which is, and you've said this, is why can't kids just wait to adult? And you've used me as an example, and not inappropriately so, because I didn't get my puberty blocked. I didn't start hormones as an adolescent. I started them in my mid-20s. I've been on them for 25 years, and look at me, things have been great. But this I've often pushed back on that and saying, yeah, it's great, but it's also because I was lucky in terms of how my male puberty went, in terms of what its physical effects were on my body, and the fact that it was able to, the effects that it had on me were more easily reversible than the effects it could have on other people. It's because I eventually, when I did transit, I had money. So I came from a privileged family. I was able to get an education. I was able to sort of push through that education. I was naturally intelligent, so even though I was struggling mentally, I could still sort of push through it. Um, not everybody has that privilege. I also had parental support at the end, like when it counted. And so I didn't have to lose my family and lose relationships over this. So all those things were luck and all those things were fortune. And the reason I turned out that as well as I did, and why many of my friends turned out as well as they did despite transitioning in their 20s or even their 30s, is because they had these things. You know, if my puberty had resulted, instead of me being sort of 5'8.5", and I was 125 pounds when I turned 18, if I had been 6'4" and 300 pounds, if I had been left with, if I had had, if I was impoverished and had to resort, let's say, to sex work or to other degrading type of experiences, my adult trans outcome would have been very different. We see those all the time, and I've often speculated, I don't have data to prove this, but we all know the adult trans population on a whole is pretty unhealthy. Like they are, like, we see, from whatever narrow view we have of I turn out well, but I see all the time trans people who are struggling with stigma, who are struggling with mental health and depression. And I sort of go back and say, like, if this had been dealt with earlier, before it had the imposition of all the struggles of struggling with dysphoria for decades, would your adult trans life have been better? Like, I see these walking disasters, and I say this with love. And I say, like, was this a predetermined outcome, or could early intervention, whatever that early intervention is, have made people's lives better? Because often the things they're struggling with, especially, and I tend to focus on needle males, are the consequences of dysphoria and the consequences of unhindered masculinization, and then having to deal with them after when you don't have the money and you don't have the insurance and you don't have the support. And you're trying to, it's like you got this dysphoria and you're going to try to move through the world as some sort of feminized person that everyone sees is still male and that you can't do anything about it. And I'm like, well, could we have avoided this?
Well, yeah. I hear what you're saying, and thoughts that go through my mind is that you did have fantastic upbringing with some privileges, things you didn't have to worry about. And you also had what sounds like an emotionally and functional, a very, very functional family.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. That you didn't have an addicted parent. You weren't being beaten. That you weren't being sexually assaulted. Like all of those things weren't happening. And you're supposing that trans women who do struggle and have not had the kind of success that you've had, that the cause is the dysphoria, and that they weren't able to pass as easily or afford procedures and the such. And I would say, having heard many trans women's stories and the stories of male detransitioners, is that the dysphoria was not in a vacuum. For many of those people, they have a parent who is bipolar, a parent who has a meth addiction or a crack addiction.
Yeah.
And that, to me, these other things going on would also, can destroy people's lives.
Yeah.
And make them be depressed and addicted. And in sex work, there's several, and I'm forgetting their names, but trans women who had full puberty blockade. And what they do for work is OnlyFans.
Yeah.
Which is still just sex work.
Yeah, no, I recognize those outcomes happen. And it's always hard, like, it's always hard when you don't have data, like hard data, and you're looking at individual anecdotes to sort of overgeneralize. But you're correct that we don't know for those, for those people who had, let's say, tumultuous childhoods or worse. but turned out trans, was it because of that childhood, or what, or what really intrinsically trans is, you're right, like transitioning is not going to solve every problem.
And is the dysphoria their biggest problem?
Yeah. And, I guess even if it is, like, I like my approach to this, or my thoughts on this, has always been, yes, there's a lot of trans people who've had mental health challenges. And some of those mental health challenges may be intrinsic, and some of those may be layered on with the dysphoria. And if the dysphoria is persistent and it's not going away, um, taking at least the dysphoria out of the picture, at least, even if it doesn't solve every problem, just like the same way, like if I treat someone with heart failure and I can, reduce their blood pressure so their heart doesn't have to pump as much into against such high pressure so the blood can flow more easily, that's a good thing. Even if I'm not solving everything that's wrong with their heart, it solves something that helps them function better. And so, does taking the dysphoria off the table, assuming, of course, that the dysphoria is longstanding, legitimate, unlikely to relent on its own, is getting that off the table. At least now we can focus on the other things. We don't have this cloud of dysphoria obscuring things. Having said that, I also know that if you are depressed and if you are autistic and if you are things, like managing my transition, and I think the parents who are managing a child's transition or adolescent transition, it requires a high degree of executive function, which is something I had. Like the ability to say, I need to do this, this, and this. It needs to be done at this date, and if I'm going to do, and I need to make this amount of money in order to afford this thing, and I need to plan this surgery, and it's going to cost me this much. I'm going to need to get this electrolysis. Like it's like if you're doing some major project, whether you're doing a house reno or you're managing a research grant or whatever it is, you have to have some degree of planning your family vacation. You have to have some degree of executive function, and I had that. And supportive parents often have that as well. Whereas a lot of people, if you're depressed or you're autistic or you're have personality disorder, to manage the executive function of a transition, even if you're dysphoric, it's a big ask. And I see this all the time in people who are struggling with their transitions. Like what it seems to me, it's like, well, you really need a coach, or you need a parent, or you need a partner who can manage these things for you, because what you're really struggling with is a lack of executive function or a lack of goal setting, or there's all these other things that play into it. But getting back to puberty, and so I'm someone who thinks, one, that, as I alluded to before, not every dysphoric child in not is that whether you're not every dysphoric child is transition, whether it's puberty blockade or cross-sex hormones. I don't think that's the right choice for every child. I do think that good clinicians can at least identify the kind of people who are like I was, because we are identifying risk factors. That at least you could start an incremental process and be like, not so much like, is this going to work all the way to the end, but with regular supervision, with psychological support, to say, like, is this actually doing the thing we want it to be doing? Like, if you were someone who was very distressed by these pubertal developments, blocking puberty makes a lot of sense for that person, if we believe that according to their demographics or their history, that their dysphoria is likely to be persistent. And then if, let's say, 6 months later, it's like blocking their puberty has not made their lives better, it hasn't resolved their dysphoria, it hasn't, then maybe you could step back and take a step back and say, are we on the right path here?
But what some people say, and this is, sorry to interrupt, but it's down the road, it'll be hard to tie it back in. I've read some people who have been through puberty blockade and feel they are happy with their transition, that blocking puberty doesn't solve dysphoria, because it just stops puberty.
Yeah.
It doesn't make your body not male.
And I think that's correct. And I think part of it is just the way it's been studied, is we haven't had a great controlled experiment or a controlled study. So like if you look at like the Olson-Kennedy data, this was the data that took a while to come out that she finally published, or the data from the GIDS in the UK, it shows exactly what you're saying, that puberty blockers tended not to improve mental health function. But what they didn't really show, because those studies weren't designed to show this, is what would have happened if they hadn't. So no change could be a good finding if the thing that would have happened would have been a negative change in the absence of puberty blockers. And narratively, it makes sense, because if the distress, and I'm not saying this is true for every trans person, but if a source of the distress is, I'd like to live my life as a girl, that's what I think right now, And I know that if I develop a deep voice, or if I develop an Adam's apple, or if I develop a broad body, that it's going to make my ability to be a girl and be seen as a girl difficult. That can be a source of distress. And if you let that process happen, the expected mental health trajectory is going to be negative. And if you block puberty, it might stabilize, which looks like no impact, but really what it's doing is preventing a decline. And we don't know that yet. So I don't want to say this is what happens. We don't have time to go into like the pathways of the UK trial. It's going to assess this as an outcome, potentially if it actually happens. But yeah, I know it's going to.
We can do another episode.
Yeah, that'll be another episode.
Trial.
On the pathways trial, but that's what they're what they're showing. And if in the end they show that it doesn't make a difference, then I'm going to be a little more negative on puberty blockers. But I think part of the problem is we've also used puberty blockers in populations where I wouldn't expect them to have a benefit. So if you give puberty blockers to a 15-year-old, where they've already gone through, and particularly for natal females, most of the pubertal changes have already taken place, or most of the gender-defining puberty changes, breast development, hip development, have already been well established by the time you're 15. I'm guessing puberty blockers ain't doing too much. I'm not expecting anything there. Same for a natal male. If you have a natal male at 16, when they've already got a deep voice and they've already got broad shoulders and they've already got facial hair developing, like I've got 15-year-olds, they've got facial hair. It's not much to look at, but it's there. If you feel their faces, it's scruffy. If you're a trans person, that's kind of distressing. Like I remember that distress of being like, oh, like and like shaving like to the bone basically to try to get that, that off because feeling it was very just like icky to me. If you have that child, then it might have a benefit. And I agree with you that puberty is not something we should be. It's consequential.
But what about girls who just? And we're also assuming that children who aren't identifying as the other sex are all happy with puberty. Many are horrified with puberty, even without cross-sex identification. That's when girls start really being a target.
Yeah.
And when, they get grabbed by boys. And I think we've all had boys cop a feel.
Yes.
When we're, 12, 11, 12, 13.
Yeah. But I think, like I said, I don't want to presume because I didn't have a girlhood. So I obviously didn't have a lot of those experiences. And but obviously I read a lot and I listen to people. And I think the difference is like there are girls who certainly, and a lot of girls, and a lot of boys do too, struggle with puberty because your hormones are surging. It makes you emotionally dysregulated. Like anyone who's raised teenagers, whether they be boys or girls, understands that puberty is not always fun and games. But that those kids still recognize it as a tribulation. Like, yes, puberty sucks. My body's doing weird things. It's making me moody, but I still want to be a man when I'm older, or if you're a boy, and I still want to be a woman when I'm older. And so I recognize
there are girls in the past who use anorexia to stop their maturation because they have already been targeted.
Yeah.
They don't want to be women.
Yeah, and I'm not ruling out the existence and the potential, particularly for kids who struggle with emotions and kids who are to use maladaptive strategies to deal with this, whether that be starvation or perhaps whether it be seeking out a different gender identity.
So should theoretically a girl if it were possible to put the question that way, if you could say, well, no, you don't need to undereat. We'll just block your puberty and you won't grow breasts. And then you don't have to hide anymore. You don't have to.
Yeah. So I think that's
you don't have to die.
Yeah. So I think that's substituting one maladaptive strategy for another maladaptive strategy. And I think what this comes to is I think physicians were way behind the curve for a long time at thinking any person who says they're dysphoric, whatever the reason, whatever the trigger, is dysphoric and likely was dysphoric from birth, and therefore transition is. I think clinicians, and I have the luxury of being able to talk to clinicians because I'm a physician and they'll talk to me, and I'm not going to name names, and I'm not, but they know what's going on now. So they, whether they were slow to recognize it is a totally different question, but they kind of know what's going on now. And many of them are starting, even if they're not necessarily shouting it on the rooftops, of saying, yeah, not all dysphoria is dysphoria. And that whether you call it ROGD specifically, or whether you recognize that some people may be using trans identification or this desire that develops in adolescence as a strategy to deal with them. Like, people are recognizing it. But I do think that a good clinician nowadays, and I'm not saying all clinicians are good, but that good clinicians who are in the mix are recognizing the criticality of making some attempt to differentiate between intrinsic, early onset, long-standing transness, and not just a report of it, but actual evidence of it, and the Johnny and Jilly come latelys who seem to develop it, or where it really intensifies, and where there are other factors where there is a reasonable suspicion that this may be a coping strategy as opposed to something that is innate or intrinsic. And so what this comes down to me is, like, we don't necessarily need to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that because these difficult patients exist who probably shouldn't have been transitioned and probably shouldn't be transitioned in the future, because they exist, that we need to abandon the whole project. That good clinicians can at least identify the people who at least are more likely to benefit, and to not necessarily put them on a pathway where it's like this is going to be a forever pathway, but with psychological support to see how things are going.
Puberty blockade and then cross-sex hormones is a forever choice.
I think it has been because of the way people used to think about gender dysphoria, but I don't think it has to be.
But it does, because it stops maturation.
It does, but I don't think it's been adequately tested or evaluated in that setting. So one of the, like I said, maybe we'll get to this on another call, but one of the things about the Pathways trial, and we can talk in more detail in another episode, is if it goes ahead, is it will show us what is the natural history, because they're going to follow several thousand patients who are not going to get any therapy aside from psychological interventions. And it will tell us they're going to get brain scans and do cognitive testing on the people who get puberty blockers and then see what happens over time. Now, you might think that the damage that's been done is not worth the effort of finding out that information, and that's an entirely different conversation. But I think, like, obviously I know people who've been through puberty blockade who are perfectly mature, functional, adults. Does it have the potential to have cognitive impacts, or to irrevocably change your maturity, your trajectory of maturity in some way? Possibly in some. It's important to find that out. But I know too many people who are gainfully employed, who are cognitively intact, who are emotionally regulated, who had puberty blockers at a young age. And it's not an obligate outcome. And so I think there's, for some people, where puberty, even though I recognize it's a natural process, if you are severely dysphoric, it's a natural process that can potentially be damaging, just like having an immune system is natural. I mess around with the immune system all the time.
Autoimmunity is a dysfunction.
Well, it is a dysfunction, but in treating autoimmunity, I am also treating the normal function of the immune system. Most drugs that treat autoimmune syndromes do not simply target the autoimmunity; they target immunity, and they do it in a way that does leave kids susceptible to infections in the short term, and does potentially have long-term implications on how your immune function, how your immune system functions as an adult.
But you're starting with a physical pathology to begin with.
I'm starting with physical, but I don't necessarily, even though I recognize physical pathologies are more objectively testable, I don't privilege physical pathologies or mental health pathologies, even though they're harder to diagnose and they're more subjective, because we all know that mental health pathologies, when severe, can be highly impactful on, if you, let's say, have untreated schizophrenia. I'm just going to use an extreme example, or untreated bipolar disorder, or untreated anorexia, and you have that in your adolescence. If you leave that untreated and just say, well, it's just mental health, it's not causing physical dysfunction, your blood work all looks normal, your CT scan, your CT scan of your head looks normal, that's going to be highly consequential on how you're going to live as an adult. Whereas if you intervene on mental health conditions early, like if you seek treatment for your severe depression, if you seek treatment for your severe anorexia or your bipolar disorder, I think you got a much better shot of having a functional adulthood than if you just say, well, you're a kid and we don't want it's a mental condition, and I don't want to throw lithium at you, and I don't want to throw neuromodulators that are going to have some impact on brain development. Like, you can make these arguments, but in the end,
right? But schizophrenia and anorexia are not identities.
Oh no, they're not identities, but they are mental health conditions. What I'm saying is dysphoria. Like, I'm not an identity person. I'm a dysphoria person. And dysphoria is a mental health challenge. It predisposes you to other mental health challenges. It causes distress on its own. And I'm a believer that if you leave distress untreated or undertreated as an adolescent, that has consequences too. And I've talked about this before, how like we understand that the suicide rates in children, dysphoric children, are low, and that the arguments that many trans advocates made about suicide prevention and not borne out, when looked at objectively, and it may be that the data is just not strong enough to detect the effect, but the threat has not materialized when looking at the data. But one thing we do know is that the suicide rate in trans adults is really high.
Yes.
And how much of that high rate, is some intrinsic property, and how many of this is the fact that these people suffered through a miserable adolescence where their dysphoria went untreated. And now, speculative. I don't have the data to show that the kids who were severely dysphoric become more suicidal as adults, but I sort of mentioned before, sort of this this fucked upness of the adult trans population, and how much of this could have been intervened upon.
Right. And yeah, for me, that bottom line is puberty.
Yeah.
And I understand that when a boy who is going to ultimately, if you can zoom fast forward, is going to transition as an adult, that transition, there's less medicalization, there's less surgery if that person never went through puberty.
Okay. So can I ask you
yeah.
So let's say we had this test that was perfect or near perfect and could identify at the age of 13 who is going to transition, if you don't block their puberty, will end up having persistent dysphoria, severe dysphoria, as an adult, and could discriminate those from the ones where the dysphoria will resolve or become easily manageable without having to pursue medicalization as an adult. Because I recognize some people live with low-grade dysphoria and they're fine with it. If there was a test that could, at the age of 13, that could separate those into two boxes, would you be more supportive
of subverting puberty?
Of the people who if like crystal ball, you develop the crystal ball, or the equivalent of the crystal ball, that says at 18 this child will still be severely dysphoric and will likely choose to pursue a transition, or will suffer with horrific dysphoria, because some people are not going to choose to transition because it's not available, or because their bodies are not going to let them. And you could put those in one box, and then you'd have another box that would say these are the kids who are going to be fine. If you don't intervene, their dysphoria will resolve. They will stay in their natal sex role, or they'll have some dysphoria, but it'll be the kind that they'll be able to find other outlets to manage and still live full lives. If you could put those people into two separate boxes and say, am I willing to subvert puberty for the kids in that first box, if that crystal ball existed?
It's just such a big deal.
Yeah.
It is such a big deal, because it does rob them of aspects of their adulthood. And I know there's a trade-off.
Yeah, because my argument,
and sometimes life is painful.
Yeah.
And we don't want children to suffer, minors to suffer.
Yeah. And
but to say yes, so you'll be as with full blockade, sexually non-functional. Sterile is even maybe less than that, because being sexually functional is important in, adult partnerships, which is also, an important thing in people living good lives.
Yeah.
So you're kind of getting at, what is that tipping point where all of the risks of remaining infantilized in some kinds of ways?
Yeah.
How is that ever better or worse than struggling with dysphoria and not being able to pass as well later?
Yeah.
For this child, would I prefer that they have a rich, robust sex life as an adult, or a prettier girl?
I think those are good questions. Like I know for me, and like I said, I didn't, when I transitioned, if someone had told me, you're going to transition appearance-wise, you'll have the look you have. You'll pass. You will, you will present as female. People will interpret you as female, but you will be sexually inert.
And you would have to have the adult understanding of what that means.
Yeah.
Because a child
A
doesn't.
child,
A 15-year-old doesn't.
I agreed.
A 12-year-old doesn't.
Yeah. But a child also may not fully understand what the implications of going through puberty and transition. They might have some understanding, but they might also be like, it's always hard. Like I said, like I don't know. Even as an adult, like a decision I made today that I think is great. Will me 5 years from now think that was a great decision? Like I don't know. Um, but there is some point where if you look at what the natural trajectory is, and every individual is going to be different, but if you had the data to show that, yeah, when these children reach 18, that they still look back at the age of 18 and say, I wish I wouldn't have had to gone through that. If you can collect that kind of data, that would be very informative. Um, so, so I know,
And
yeah.
yeah, and that crystal ball would also need to include that person being able to know down the road, oh, I wish I at least had left my fertility intact to have a family. And
Yeah.
I know that yes, people can adopt, and surrogacy is another topic, but people use that too. But I know detransitioners who regret that they will never be able to have children
Yeah.
because in their dysphoria, which came from childhood, they chose castration as an adult, with a vaginoplasty, and now regret it and wish they could have children.
Yeah.
They're now having to take, two men I'm thinking of are having to take testosterone shots for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And speaking of like testosterone shots forever, there's another cohort that can tell us a lot about the subversion of puberty, and that is people who have various conditions that result in puberty not happening.
Yeah.
James Linehan is one, and I had a boyfriend who had one of those conditions, and but there are two. There are more. We can also look at their lives, and how not having puberty, or at least not a normal puberty, not in their teens at all. They might have gotten grown up in their 20s. What effects has that had?
Yeah, no, like I said, I don't want to underplay the importance of puberty. And obviously clinically, I know people who have things like panhypopituitarism who wouldn't go through natural puberty unless you induced it, or who had, let's say, chemotherapy as children, and lost their ovaries or lost their testicles, and so I recognize, like I said, I don't want to diminish the criticality of puberty, and that stopping puberty should not be a willy-nilly kind of like, oh, it's no big deal, but we'll just go through some other puberty later, kind of decision. But it's still recognizing that for some cohort of trans people, and if we could identify them, that the consequences of puberty have long-term implications. And I think a lot of people who are gender critical, I think this goes both ways. I think people who are gender critical completely discount the impacts that puberty have on long-term, going through a non-desired puberty has on long-term functionality and quality of life. Just like a lot of trans advocates downgrade or discount the consequentiality of orgasms or sexual function or fertility. Oh, you can just adopt. Oh, yeah, don't worry. You'll figure it out. I think both sides are guilty of discounting these things that are really meaningful. And I think this is why it becomes such a hard decision, and really why in my opinion, I really think this needs to be individualized, by, ideally for young kids, by parents who really understand what these full implications are. And like I said, parents are often put in these very unenviable situations, and all kinds of situations where they have to make some decision, I'm taking this out of the gender dysphoria realm, some decision that if they make it one way, will have one set of implications for their child as an adult. And if they make it another, will have a different set of implications for that child as an adult. In my field, it's like, should we cut out this person's colon at the age of 12 and leave them with a permanent ostomy? Or do I put them on medications that are going to alter their immune system for the rest of their life to avoid that surgery? And that child, when they're 22, and when they're 12, has no concept of what the right choice or what their 22-year-old self will want. But that 22-year-old might look back and go like, why didn't you give me the drugs? I'm stuck with this ostomy. Or why did you give me these drugs and now I've developed this weird condition when you could have just solved this with surgery? Like, those are kids who may regret some decision their parents had made that was necessary, that was highly consequential, but that parent had no idea what that kid's values and preferences were going to be as an adult. So
Right, right. And, again, gender dysphoria is a mental symptom.
yeah,
It's not, and we're also talking right now as if medical transition is the only way to alleviate, to create some stopgap tools, something.
yeah. And the first is that I've come around a lot, and I really do think that offering medical therapies as first line or offering it to everybody who says they have dysphoria is probably not the right path. And that we probably should be employing more psychological interventions, particularly for those children where their dysphoria trajectory is less clear or where it's shorter or where they have significant comorbidities that are going to make a transition difficult to manage. It makes a lot of sense for me. Even if some people want to call it conversion therapy, I think like these exploratory therapies are probably, and I recognize the evidence base is still emerging for them, seems like a sensible approach for most children as first line. But for the children who are clearly not doing well, I want to leave this door open, where they're clearly deteriorating, where the psychological intervention is not, where there's no root cause to be addressed, or that managing the other sort of comorbidities is not alleviating the dysphoria. I really think it's a better world when we leave that door open, and hopefully we'll have the data that will support it. Like I said, I cannot condone prior practice. It doesn't make sense anymore. But I also think that banning it outright is going to damage and hurt a lot of the kids like me. And so, like, I know we've talked for, I think, about an hour and a half, and I want to make sure we have a tight episode here.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we could talk for hours and hours. There's tons we didn't cover. Maybe like in the last episode, like you asked me, is there anything I said that was that resonated or that changed your mind? Is there anything that I said that sort of made you think a little bit different, or maybe soften your positions, or made you think about something maybe a different way that you hadn't approached before? And it's okay to say no if it hasn't.
Yeah. My takeaway that I at this point can't really answer so directly is that for those few kids for whom nothing else is going to help them feel embodied in the body they already have, that yes, puberty does create, it has important facts, but it does have some consequences, especially for the boys.
Yeah.
That they would just have to deal with.
Yeah. And I think for some girls too, particularly the ones who are like transition, I know we talked about transition maybe not being the best choice for most of them, but if they have transition from a young age, because, having a double mastectomy is a major surgery, so I think for those two, but I think one thing we can probably agree on is that should be a very small group. And that probably a lot of the increase that the clinics were seeing is sort of obscures this very small group. Now, in terms of like things that you said, and maybe these weren't all things that you said today, but things we've perhaps had in other conversations, is about this notion of that people, that dysphoria is not always dysphoria, and that there are, like one thing that I learned a lot by talking to women is the experience of being a girl, because I didn't have that experience. And the pressures that girls face that I can read about and that I can imagine, but have never experienced, how this can potentially lead people down a dysphoria pathway, and how we really need to be much more in tune to the lives of girls and to the relationships between girls before immediately running to a dysphoria diagnosis. So not everything that looks like dysphoria is dysphoria, and certainly not everything that looks like dysphoria should be treated like old school dysphoria. We really need to be much more circumspect, especially around girls, and providing them with the tools they need to grow up to be healthy girls, even if they grow up to be autistic girls. Being an autistic girl is still a perfectly good way to be, even if you're not sort of into the normal girly things in the end. I think preserving fertility, preserving the ability to have a full sex life, and preserving the ability to be gender congruent, I think are really something we should be aiming for. So, anything you want to say? Anything else to wrap up?
No, it's been good talking with you about this. We touched on a lot of things, and then we could make a whole other episode on the other things that we didn't talk about.
Yeah,
it would be worthwhile to talk about the Pathways trial.
Yeah,
with
no,
what we know about it already
yeah,
at
like
some point.
yeah, and like I said, I'm sort of a nominal supporter of the Pathways trial, even though I look at the protocol and say like, there's some things I do differently, but I know I wanted to go ahead. You might think different, but yeah, I think that would be a great thing for a future episode. And also for any of our listeners or viewers, feel free to put in the comments if anything you want us to talk about in the future. If there's a particular area of gender medicine or just the gender experience that you think is worth exploring, that you'd like us to have a balanced and non-fighty conversation about, we'd love to hear your ideas. And with that, we'll bid you adieu until our next episode. Have a great week, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.